Welcome back, Stillmaniacs. Today we're having another stab at Stillmania. But before we start, be sure to like, share and subscribe so you don't miss an update. I've come to accept my Stillmania is terminal. There doesn't seem to be much I can do about the festering sore in my side that just won't heal until every glorious article has been covered. It's been decades since Nigel Stillman graced the hallowed pages of White Dwarf, yet his infectious ethos and mindset continue unabated by time. I believe that this wargaming style, if you will, is born of a true love of the game and gaming itself. If we briefly take a look at why we game, there is a clear and obvious answer: to have fun. If it wasn't fun, then it would be logical to assume we wouldn't do it. But Stillmania takes this fun to a different, more immersive level. Immersion. It's an interesting concept, to lose oneself in the game. Computer games are pursuing this with ever greater success, especially now we have virtual reality and the like. Back in the 90s, however, we didn't have copious amounts of internet floating around to tap into at will. We had good old-fashioned pencils, paper and, dare I say it, imagination. A scary notion for some, no doubt, but it worked well for many of us. I, for one, used to keep a history of the battles my armies had fought, writing down a narrative to explain the outcomes of many of their exploits. A tapestry of conflict. By the time I was in my 20s, I had completed several books worth. Unfortunately, I am yet to find them after many years of searching my parents' home. Without truly knowing it, I guess I was abiding by the venerable principles of Stillmania, even back then. Having no doubt read the articles in White Dwarf at the time, I must have unconsciously picked up many of the ideas and continued them in my own wargaming endeavours. Anyway, Nigel is famous for the documenting of his superb Bretonnian army, from concept to execution and then into full-on battle. Without further ado, let's dive in and see what we learn. Questing for the Grail. I am in the unique position of having helped to make sure that there is a new, up-to-date Bretonnian army. The Bretonnians always were my favourite army because they appealed to my interest in medieval Arthurian fantasy, as portrayed in such films as Excalibur and evocative Victorian paintings like The Lady of Shalott. I am also pleased that the army will have the look of a medieval army as portrayed in the films Braveheart and Henry V. The French knights in the 1944 film look just like Bretonnian knights. This means I could use the models for a medieval scenario or Robin Hood skirmish if I wanted to, and the models look considerably more impressive than any specifically medieval ones I have ever seen. Also, I will be able to impress people who have not yet encountered the Warhammer hobby by showing them an army they might recognise as inspired by medieval knights or Arthurian fantasy. Maybe I can convert a few people. Quite apart from that, knightly armies have plenty of hard-hitting shock troops that can be painted up to look magnificent. While I was waiting, I considered what my army should look like. I also looked at books about the Middle Ages to get more ideas. In the meantime, I busied myself making terrain, which is always useful. Note, a knowledge and interest in history is often a route into the hobby. Indeed, useful reference books full of heraldry and illustrations of medieval knights and castles can be found in your local public library. It is fair to say that I've considered collecting a mighty army of Britannia or the Empire myself, something I am currently trying to justify to my bank balance and wife. Carving out a feudal domain. Another reason I have for opting for a Bretonnian army is to collect knights, which I can then use for jousting games like the one in Perilous Quest, the rules for which are also in White Dwarf 215. So, having a Bretonnian army allows me to play several different games: Warhammer, jousting tournaments, and small battles between rival retinues of feudal knights. For the tourneys and skirmishes, I will seek out other players with Bretonnian armies and maybe even take part in mini campaigns. As part of the project, I shall indulge my interest in building terrain by making a small castle, a Grail chapel, and a tourney field complete with tents and pavilions. I shall also make all kinds of odds and ends to go with my army, like baggage wagons, peasants, and so on. The call to arms. As the Bretonnian models began to appear, I started to gather my army. First to come were the plastic knights and archers. When I acquired the new Warhammer game, I got pretty well all the plastic knights and archers I am likely to need. Certainly enough to give me a respectable unit of Knights of the Realm. I begin to assemble and base up the plastic knights and archers. Before assembling, I tidy them up with a small file to remove any bits of sprue and mould lines. This doesn't take long, but considerably improves the final appearance of the finished model. Sometimes I do this after full assembly, so I can remove tacky bits of glue or file down junctions between plastic parts for a smooth surface. Assembling the plastic knights is actually quite tricky. I find polystyrene cement is the best for plastics. Superglue gets all over my fingers because it is runnier and I am clumsy and impatient. Contact glue is better, but never dries absolutely hard, and is better for metal to metal or metal to plastic bonds than plastic to plastic. The tricky part is getting the tails to stick onto the horses at a sensible angle, although it is probably realistic for a few tails to swish to either side. I usually stick the tails and heads to one side first, then put the two sides of the horse together, which means you'll need to remove the locating tabs. Note, while I was doing all this, I still had only a vague idea what the army would look like on paper. Indeed, when you begin collecting a Bretonnian army, all you really need to know is that you will need a large contingent of knights. Fine-tuning the army will come after I have a reasonable pool of models to choose from, and I have begun playing games to discover my own style of play, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of the army. I will use the tournament-style 2,000-point army as a guide, but I have no intention of creating a contrived power gamer's army. This approach gives me no satisfaction and plays down the artistic aspect of the hobby. It is very important to me for the army to be in character with its background and ethos, to such an extent that I will only choose magic items that fit in, and I will actually model them onto the figures. To do anything else is, in my view, a slapdash and superficial approach to building an army, and lets down the hobby in the eyes of the world. I probably subscribe to the view of the Wargamer's army as an identity statement. Impetuous Knights. When assembling the knights, I was careful to position the lance arms at the right angle. Some arms need to be stuck on at a particular angle because the clothing is draping in a certain way, or so that the knight will sit on the horse properly. By preference, I would like lances levelled or tilted forwards, because this makes it easier to put the knights in a box to carry the army around, and lances which stand upright are more vulnerable to breaking. I did not stick on any plastic shields, since I intend to leave this until after I have painted the knights. Sometimes I stick everything together, including shields, before painting, because then the parts are all firmly glued on under the paint and are less liable to fall off. When assembling models, I always give great priority to making a robust model which will stand up to the rigours of handling in games. Otherwise, the army begins to look tatty, and you are bound to drop things now and again. I always make models and terrain tough enough to stand a rough handling. With the Bretonnians, I left off the shields until after because of the need to paint heraldic designs on the knights. Next, I stick the knights onto their horses. I stick knights with their lances levelled onto horses with heads lowered, because these look like they are charging. Knights with lances raised should ride horses with heads raised. In this way I consider the overall appearance of the regiment at the earliest stage possible. This is something that interests me greatly. I give greater priority to my models looking good as a unit rather than looking good as individuals. This is something which people do not usually consider and just stick things together any old way, mingling models together in the unit without thought. It doesn't matter how well they are painted, the unit will always look out of place and manic from a range of 24 inches, or, in other words, to you, your opponents, and 100% of casual observers. I take this so seriously that if any models don't look the part in the unit at any stage of the work, out they go. I want my units to look warlike, as though they are really charging or advancing or whatever. In this way, I am directing the appearance of my army like a film director does with his hordes of extras. No doubt they did this in the making of the film Braveheart and made the soldiers retake the scenes a few times to get it right. Well, it's exactly the same with a model army. I have always thought that there is a strong analogy between epic films and battles with model soldiers. Variation in poses and choosing the right combinations within a unit is vital for animating the unit in this way. My plastic knights exhibit variation with their different crests, the angle of the lances, and movement in the horses' heads. But I will be adding metal models to the units for greater variety. Finally, I stick the completed mounted knights to their bases. When the knights are firmly based, I use plastic wood filler and a small spatula to texture the bases. This holds the horses on firmly, looks good, and provides a rough surface which can be painted or covered in flock or sand. Now I could use ready mixed plaster or PVA glue mixed with sand into a paste, or PVA glue with sand sprinkled over it to texture the bases. I use wood filler because it is very easy to use on small areas and dries quickly. If you stick a few small pebbles to the base, the plastic knight will gain some weight, making it feel more like the metal ones, and making it less prone to slipping off hill slopes during battle. I assembled and based the plastic archers according to the same principles, but they were much simpler to do. I do not intend to use much archery in my army, and will fill out any archer units with metal models to vary the poses. With archers, animating the unit depends on having the models shooting in roughly the same direction, not at any old angle. You could also make sure that all models in a unit are either shooting or moving or about to draw their bows. This is as far as I'm going to take my initial batch of troops. I am not going to begin painting until I've gathered some more models. I can then think about painting the greater part of the army as a single effort. This will give the army a unified style of painting and is just an easier and neater way of working in a confined workspace. The retinue grows. Gradually, as they were released, I began acquiring Bretonnian metal miniatures. I decided to get most things and then decide what to do with them afterwards. I do not know if I will use all the troop types in my army, but it's useful to have some of each to vary the composition from time to time. Even a few models of specific troop types are useful to provide the core of a unit to build on if I suddenly decide to add the unit to my army. Extra standard bearers, musicians, and models which can be used as characters are also useful in this respect. In my view, an army consists not only of the troops you usually expect to fight with, but also a host of other odd and spare models or part units which can be used to vary the army from time to time. With metal miniatures, I think it is very important to look at the models thoroughly before doing anything to them. Try assembling multi-part models a few times and a few different ways before touching any glue. Metal models do not always come out of moulds or blister packs unscathed, and you need to make sure spear shafts are straight. Find out where the mould lines are, check for flash, see how the slots fit into the slotter bases, see how shields fit on, and decide where to trim and bend things a bit to bring out the best of the model. There will be occasions when you will have to use tools to make things fit when they are reluctant to do so. I never stick models together as quickly as possible. The sculpture is worth a better crack at it than that. As I gather my army, long before I assemble or paint it, I inspect the models for days, maybe weeks before touching them with tools, glue or paintbrushes. I lay them out in rough ranks or regiments. In this way, I get to know the raw material I will be working with. It's amazing how many expert painters do not take a pair of pliers and simply straighten the tabs on their models so that they stand up properly in their slaughter bases. They must sit for hours shading a model that is leaning over enough to fall flat on its face. How they manage not to notice this astounds me. Similarly, bent spears look stupid. I cannot understand how anyone can lack the basic instinct to straighten a spear shaft before painting it. Yet I've seen all these things on models painted to a standard I could never hope to equal. Order in the ranks. Another thing to watch out for is the direction that a model is looking, shooting, or pointing his weapon. When basing models, particularly infantry, I carefully consider how they will fit onto their bases, and then how they will form ranks in the unit. Models should be pointing their weapons at the enemy, not prodding each other. Once again, you often see models in the same unit facing or shooting at all angles, even in nicely painted units, because the player has not thought about what he is doing. So, one task I must do is make sure I have the right slaughter bases for the job and cut out the straight slots in angled slaughter bases if necessary. Affairs of Errantry. Among my first batch of metal models were Knights Errant. I definitely wanted these in the army because I liked the reckless energy of the young knights as depicted by the models, and because a unit of them riding under the Errantry banner will be exceptionally useful in my battle plans. I assembled the plastic horses as I've already described, but preparing the metal knights presented a new problem. I have to file off the mould lines to improve the final finish. Mould lines or flash are an inevitable result of the metal moulding process, as I know from my own countless experiments years ago. Industrially produced models made of high quality metal do of course have minimal flash and barely discernible mould lines, but I do a little bit of filing just to be sure. Then I stick on the lance arms, being careful once again to position the lances realistically, in keeping with the poses of the rest of the models. Of course, as a general rule in my army, I will decide what looks best for the unit and will not feel particularly obliged to stick with the intentions of the designers. The models are just raw material to be brutally bludgeoned into a shape as I see fit. For the Knights Errant, I chose to have the lances levelled. So, for any of the variant poses that have lances raised, I swap lances around for substitute lance arms of plastic knights and disguise awkward joints using modelling putty. This approach applies to all the knights I shall be tackling. On the whole, the Knights Errant are how I want them already, and I will not need to do much conversion work. Converting models. Now that I've converted some models made of the new metal, I've come to some conclusions as to the best approach. The old metal had a lead content, which meant that it was slightly softer. This made it possible to do quite ambitious conversions, although such work was always difficult and rarely attempted. The new metal is harder than the old metal. This means that cutting or trimming with a modelling knife is ruled out in favour of using metal clippers, the file and the modelling saw. The model should also be held firmly in a mini vise for any serious trimming or sawing. Fortunately, being a harder metal, it can withstand the vise better, although detail can be damaged unless the model is held very carefully. I have not yet discovered a way to do this, but perhaps using something like balsa wood or pencil rubbers between the vise and the models is the answer. Modest conversions are a better option than ambitious ones. The new metal can be drilled with a mini modelling drill better than the old metal because it is harder. You are less likely to drill away the model's fist. Even so, the model must be secure when it is being drilled, and you should proceed very carefully and patiently. Drilling allows you to pin together heavy bits of metal for greater strength when assembling models. It also allows you to change weapons in a model's hands or replace weapons with standard poles. Some parts of metal models can simply be snipped off with clippers, and the new metal results in a fairly clean break. Otherwise, parts can be sawn off. This allows head swaps and arm swaps. Plastic models are, of course, ideal for conversion, and also as a source of parts. Plastic is much easier to cut, clip, file and saw than metal. Plastic weapons can be added to metal models, and head, arm and torso swaps are easier with plastic models. The fact that more metal models now come with torsos in 2 halves or with separate weapon arms opens up the possibilities for conversion, and I've taken advantage of this in building my Bretonnian army. Some of my conversions resulted from mixing up the parts of models in my work tray and not being able to remember which bits went together on the same model. I just kept on trying different bits in combination until I got results that I liked. Few See the Grail. I have also got a few Grail Knights. However, I'm not sure about making these a feature of my army, even though they are impressive models and fight well. Firstly, Grail Knights would be very rare in a typical Bretonnian army. I suspect that only a mighty host raised by a duke or king would have a unit of more than about 6. In smaller armies, they are much more likely to be present only as 1 or 2 characters, such as the general. I intend my army to represent a small retinue, certainly never bigger than 3,000 points if I used everything, and most of the time only 2,000 points. Secondly, the Grail Knights are rather too ornate for me. I am inclined towards simple and striking heraldry, which will not be too difficult to paint. So I put the Grail Knights to one side for now, but pick out 1 or 2 to be converted into extra standard bearers and characters. I remove the Grails from their crests so that they can be whatever type of knight I want. Generally, I do not want the crests of my knights to be too ornate, because I feel these would be reserved for jousting tournaments, while smaller, more robust crests would be worn for recognition in battle. So, I am prepared to prune or remodel crests, if necessary. The common multitudes. I've also got a lot of men-at-arms with spears, a few metal archers, and few halberdiers. The spearmen are in such a good advancing pose and will look so effective as a unit in serried ranks that I will have a big unit of these. This is both useful and realistic. The halberdiers I shall put to one side in case I want a unit of these later. I pick out 1 or 2 from the command group to mix in with the spearmen, or to use as extra or variant standard bearers and musicians. I convert some of them by carefully sawing off weapon shafts with a small modelling saw and drilling out the fists to take another weapon or standard pole. I leave them at that stage for later. The metal archers have varied poses, and I favour these above the plastic ones, largely because they feel heavier. So I pick out enough to make a small arrowhead formation. I then begin basing the infantry. I find that the metal slots usually fit in the slotter bases fairly firmly, but some stand up better if you bend the metal tab slightly to increase grip. Then I liberally coat the tab and slot with tacky contact glue like Bostik, Uhu or Evo Stick and put them together. This is a task requiring care because often even nicely painted models appear to lurch drunkenly at odd angles because people have based them without thinking about it. When dry, I paint a bit of PVA over the slot to hold the model in more firmly. When this is dry, I texture the base with plastic wood filler ready for the final layer of sand or flock. The models are now really firmly based. I do not stick on the shield so I can paint the livery colours neatly on the soldiers first. I may sort through my shields and put longer elf-style shields on the infantry, although I am not sure about this yet. It's only an idea. Mighty Lords. The next metal miniatures to be released were various knightly characters. I got several of these, including more than one Green Knight. This is such an imposing figure that I had to have one to convert into my general. I'm not particularly bothered about using him as the special character he represents. I will use others perhaps to convert into heroes and an army standard bearer. I prepared one of the models to wield a morning star by removing his sword and drilling a hole through his fist. Then I put a shaft cut from a discarded lance in his hand. Later I will model the spiky balls and add them with short lengths of chain. I do not know exactly what bits I will use to do this yet, so I will just have to hunt in various places such as bead shops where they sell bits for making jewellery. The Green Knight model rides a metal horse, which presented new problems for assembly. When the model is stuck together, I go over the joins with a file and smooth off any mould lines at the same time. I usually paint a small amount of PVA over the join, using a small paintbrush. The PVA dries hard and seals the join, making it a bit stronger and smoother. Then I base the horse on its cavalry base and texture it as I have already described. I did a few conversions on some of the other character models to make them into standard bearers or give them alternative weapons or vary the position of the lances to fit in with my theme of charging knights with levelled lances. I don't do anything to the trumpeters except assemble and base them. What to look for in a good warhorse. Some of the horses have metal heads. I pay no attention to which knight actually goes with each head, unless they both have the same crest. I just put charging knights on horses with lowered heads as before. When all of this batch of knights are brought up to the same level of assembly, that is, based but lacking shields and ready for undercoating, I put them with the other knights and begin to arrange them into regiments in lance formations of 6 or 10. I allocate knights to units according to their pose and animation so that the unit will look dynamic. If this means mixing up knights of different orders, I just remove or alter any crests that contradict my plan. I will take care to depict the correct heraldry when it comes to painting. At the moment, I envisage painting up the majority of knights as Knights of the Realm, with one unit of Knights Errant and one of Questing Knights. Cracks in the armour. After assembling, converting and basing my army, which now amounts to a considerable retinue, I reviewed the troops arranged in their provisional units. I rearranged them in different ways to see what sort of units look best, bearing in mind the tactics I might be able to use with such units. Some knights have lances levelled, others have lances raised. This allows two possibilities. One is to put all the knights with lances lowered in the same units and all knights with lances raised in the same units. Alternatively, and this is best when using lance formation, I could put the knights with levelled lances in the outer rank and the knights with raised lances in the inner rank. One great advantage of being able to paint up knights with individual heraldry is that I can swap them about and rearrange units even after the army is painted, without spoiling the colour scheme of the unit too much. While reviewing the unpainted troops, I noticed that where I have used plastic lance arms on metal knights, I need to use modelling putty to make the mantles of the surcoats the same length on both arms. I also noticed another irritating bit of work I need to do before painting. This was that the join lines were still visible on some models and would be seen after painting. These had to be filled in order to get a good finish and not let down the final paint job. I began thinking how to do this. I could use PVA glue painted on, modelling putty or plastic wood filler applied with a small spatula. I overfill the cracks. I can just file them down smooth to create a good surface for painting when dry. The Panache of Squires. When the mounted and foot squires appeared, I got quite a lot of them, because I think they will be very useful in my battle plans. There are so many things you can do with fast troops and skirmishers to support the knights. The squires come in many varied poses and every model looks different, so I have no conversion to do. I assemble and base them as I've already described for the rest of my army. Finally, there are the Bretonnian sorceresses. I shall have female wizards, probably 2 or 3 level 1s in my army to use the variant figures. They can represent Grail damsels from the local Grail chapel, so I must invent a suitable way to paint their garb, perhaps featuring the fleur-de-lis motif. Now, apart from forthcoming models of questing knights with varied crests and special characters which I shall convert, if required, to mix into my knightly units as heroes, my army is virtually ready for the next stage, which is the painting. But before tackling this, I need to plan the composition of the army in more detail, so that I know how I am going to paint up each unit and exactly which models belong to which units. That just about wraps up the third of the Stillmania articles and the first in a mini-series of questing for the Grail. With it in mind, I encourage you to take some of this valuable knowledge into your own wargaming. Join me next time for some more wargaming content. Thanks very much for watching. Peace.